Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Snow White and the Huntsman, starring Kristen Stewart, Chris Hemsworth, Charlize Theron, Sam Claflin, Ian McShane, Sam Spruill, Bob Hoskins, Ray Winstone, Nick Frost, Eddie Marson, Toby Jones, and Dave Legeno. Forgive me if I said that wrong. Directed by Rupert Saunders. Now, before I get into this movie, I remember going to theaters for this thing, and I remember it being pretty bad. But will it hold up as far as one of the bad ones or the worst one? As I remember this one being a piece of crap. And it's from the same director as the last year's version of The Crow, which I don't know. It's not saving his career as far as I'm concerned. Let's get into the movie and you'll see what I mean. We start with the narration by the huntsman, played by Chris Hemsworth, Thor himself, otherwise known as, about the legend of Snow White's mother giving birth to Snow White, as she's adored for her beauty over the years, while her childhood friend William talks with her as a little girl. And this narration by Chris Hemsworth doesn't make much sense, as it goes rather quickly, as we learn Snow White's mother has died from being sick, and we get a war sequence that I swear was reminding me of the war sequence in the beginning of Gladiator, which is a film. Well, anyways, as I was getting vibes from that scene, watching this war sequence, and the bad guys turn into these tiny micro rocks that look like the pieces of the robot, not like you know what I mean, right? Like the crystal looking robot looking thing from the movie Big Hero 6 in the beginning of that film. And Snow White's father finds Ravenna, played by Charlize Theron, and marries her while Snow White believes she's beautiful. When she marries her father, and during the wedding, Ravenna looks at Snow White all jealous because she'll eventually be queen, until Ravenna gets the king in the bedroom and she poisons him and stabs him and takes over the throne. And Charlize Theron is convincing as a villain, as I've seen villains she's played and reviewed them, but I don't care for this villainess, as the writing was just terrible. As she invites her brother Finn and his armies into the castle to take over the castle and imprison Snow White for years, as William has no choice but to abandon her. And what a lame opening sequence. Ravenna brings the mirror on the wall in the bedroom and asks Mirror, Mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all. And the mirror says she is and like I said, she imprisons Snow White, and years later, she becomes an adult and played by Kristen Stewart. And can I be blunt at this point? She's not great in this role, as she comes off obnoxious as Snow White. And when I get to the live action Snow White movie, I'll see how Rachel Zegler does compared to Kristen Stewart, because so far, in my opinion, Kristen Stewart is the worst Snow White I've seen on screen, and she meets Greta while Ravenna baths in something that I swear to God looked like cream, as she gets her body when she gets it in her body when it could be stinky to bathe in to give to the townsfolk, which is disgusting to me. And we move on to Ravenna, and we move on to Duke Hammond and his son William, played by Sam Claflin, who was Finnick in the Hunger Games sequels, and he's not good in this movie either, as Ravenna once almost kills William, and the cinematography in this is pretty bad looking. Ravenna fears she's growing old and her powers are fading, and she feeds her power on Greta as she looks her young, beautiful self, as Greta comes back, and when she comes back, she learns from the mirror Snow White is the fairest of them all, and she has to kill her. And she could have as a child. And the mirror on the wall suggests that while Snow White sees a type of bird leading her to find a way out with a nail that's bent, and Finn tries to take her out to Ravenna, and she stabs him in the neck. And she's trying to be a badass. And as I don't necessarily buy it from Kristen Stewart, as she's a terrible actress after the Charlie's Angels remake to Twilight, which is a series I'll maybe get to one day, but we'll see about that. As Greta tells her to run away, as she does from the guards, and gets as far away from the castle as she can, and lands on a deserted beach somewhere where she finds a white horse and rides away with it, as Ravenna gets pissed at Finn because Snow White has escaped. And the acting in this is very bad, as I don't connect with any of the characters. And this is worse than last time with Mirror Mirror, as Lily Collins was a stupid Snow White. But in my opinion, Kristen Stewart is the worst Snow White, unless if Rachel Zegler surpasses it, which I'm not sure about. I haven't seen that movie to figure that out, but so far Kristen Stewart's the worst Snow White. Ravenna has to hire a huntsman as we see the huntsman getting kicked out of a bar and gets his ass kicked as people laugh at him, which sounds obnoxious, and the sound effects were just unforgivable, as the 1937 Disney film does a better job with sound effects than the last two movies. And Finn finds the huntsman on his ass and is brought to Ravenna, and she offers his gold to find Snow White, and she brings up how he'll see his wife again, which sounds tormenting. And this movie's ridiculous because she hires the huntsman without knowing what she did to Ravenna and go into the woods he promised we would never go back to because of the death of his wife. And this arc is weak, as this movie is weakly told by director Rupert Saunders. And just for the record, Chris Hemsworth's character doesn't have a name in this movie, as I might learn in the next one that he might have a name, but not in this movie. The huntsman finds Snow White as he learns Ravenna is going to betray him as she tricked him into finding Snow White, and the action scenes are pretty flat, as the huntsman is easily defeated by Finn. And the huntsman gets away and finds out who Snow White is, and why does Ravenna want her dead? Well, Finn gets poisoned, and Snow White tells the huntsman she's trying to get an army to fight with her, and she makes a deal with the huntsman. Meanwhile, Finn gets back to the castle and tells people to hunt Snow White and the huntsman. And sometimes it was very hard to, during the action sequence, who was who, as that was distracting me, as we see William fighting Ravenna's men, and then Snow White escaped, and he looks for her. Meanwhile, Snow White and the huntsman encounter some sneaks, as Finn hires the dwarves to go after Snow White and the huntsman. And do I give a crap about this? Absolutely frickin' not, because this movie makes no sense whatsoever. Snow White and the huntsman encounter some trolls as they attack them, and Snow White roars at the troll, and that doesn't make her a badass, but it makes her look more stupid, as last time that barely made Snow White badass in Mirror Mirror, but here it's throughout, as that's not the Snow White I know as far as the story is concerned. And Snow White and the huntsman encounter both people and tell them they mean no harm and go to their village, and it's all women and children, and they stay here for one night as the huntsman runs off away because he knows the truth about Snow White, as Ravenna wants both the huntsman and Snow White dead, as he gets as far away from her as possible. And I just don't care for this movie at all. The village gets on fire, and Snow White almost gets captured by the bad guys until the huntsman saves her life and gets as far away from the village as possible, while Ravenna is getting weaker and weaker, and the huntsman decides to take Snow White to Duke Hammond, and they encounter the seven dwarves: Bieth, played by Ian McShane; Muir, played by Bob Hoskins; Gort, Ray Winstone; Neon, played by Nick Frost; Dwyer, played by Eddie Marsan; Cole, played by Toby Jones; and Quirt, played by Johnny Harris, as they have beef with the huntsman, and hear them both as the huntsman says to them Snow White is from the palace, and they fight against Ravenna, and Finn suddenly arrives as the dwarves give them a hiding spot with them, and they learn Snow White is the future queen, as she talks with the birds and animals, and the special effects in this movie look absolutely awful. And I don't really care for these dwarves, as they're completely not the dwarves I remember from the Disney film. The dwarves tell Snow White they used to fight alongside her father, as she and the huntsman sleep there for the night, and next morning comes, and Snow White sees tiny people that I swear look like goblins, but I believe they're fairies, as the birds and animals talk to Snow White, as the huntsman and the dwarves are amazed by her talent. And guess what? This story is so far crappy that I can't believe when I went to this horrible schlock since I first saw this in theaters, as it was bad then, and guess what? It's still a very bad movie, as nothing could fix this movie at this point, as Snow White, the huntsman, and the dwarves are being attacked by Finn until William comes in to her rescue. And why is this movie a little over 2 hours long? As it's too long for a Snow White movie, in my opinion. The huntsman kills Finn, and Ravenna feels it as her heart gets weaker and weaker, and one of the dwarves does unfortunately die. And guess what? I don't give a crap, as William catches up to them, and they bury the dead dwarf, and I was taking notes on the unrated version as there's a 4-minute difference, as I can't tell where this is with the extended cut. You like either way you like I said, I just can't fix this movie at all. William explains to Snow White how sorry he is as he left her, and if he thought she were alive, he would have came back for her. And why is this movie so badly and poorly acted? As is it because Rupert Saunders? Maybe. Is it the actors not caring for the roles? Maybe. But is the writing a bunch of crap? You know what? Absolutely. Excuse me. As how can you make the worst in the story of Snow White? This succeeded, and at this point, I'm angry at this movie, and am I about to be checked out of it? Yes, I am. After the conversation, Snow White kisses William and she takes an apple from William, and after she bites it, she gets poisoned, and I'm thinking, is William the bad guy? Nah, it's just Ravenna in disguise as William and is looking older than Charlize Theron looks as the huntsman, and William attack Ravenna and she turns into a crow and escapes as the dwarves arrive and can't do a damn thing to cure Snow White. And William kisses her out of true love while Ravenna gets back to the castle looking rather muddied up and begs the mirror on the wall for something to, as I don't get why she did what she did in the mirror to the mirror. As the huntsman, William, and the dwarves bring the body of Snow White to Duke Hammond, and they arrest her as the huntsman says to Snow White he's married to a woman named Sarah, which is the character that's going to be introduced in the next movie. As I don't know if it's a prequel to this pile of crap or is it a sequel. I'll talk about it next time. And I'll also see if it gets any worse than this, as I haven't seen it since theaters, but this feels like the poor telling of Snow White. The huntsman kisses Snow White, and she awakens as William wants to fight Ravenna, and Duke doesn't want to start a war. And Snow White goes to Duke and William to ask for a fight against Ravenna and makes a speech to the townspeople, and the speech was very thinly acted. And there's a reason I'm not a fan of Kristen Stewart in general, because her acting is pretty damn thin, in my opinion, as well as this movie, and as well as Twilight, and as well as every other movie. I have yet to see Spencer, but I haven't seen it yet. Well, it was a terrible speech that she gave in this movie to begin with, as they gear up to prepare for battle against Ravenna, Finn, and her guards, and they ride to the castle. When they arrive, they try to find a way in by sneaking in from the prison grounds. As the dwarves sneak into the castle from the sewers, and they start the battle by the dwarves knocking down some guards as they sneak around the castle, and the army led by Snow White arrives to the castle. And does it try to be clever as far as tricks are concerned? Not really, but the battles begins by scaring the army away from the castle, but it doesn't work. And does this movie work as a story? No. It doesn't work in my opinion. The dwarves get the army inside the castle successfully, and they fight the guards, and Snow White looks for Ravenna to fight her off on her own, as the huntsman and William go with her after she goes inside on her. And the score in that scene was distracting, as Snow White finds Ravenna alongside with the huntsman, and William and some of the army comes in and behind them, and they fight like monsters that look like Micro Machines in Big Hero 6. And Ravenna has Snow White looking at them dying, as Snow White gets her ass kicked by Ravenna until she tries to get her sword, as Ravenna almost kills her with the stab, but Snow White guts her and Ravenna becomes afraid of her, and Snow White tells Ravenna she can't have her heart. As she grows older and dies, and the monsters get melted because of Ravenna's death, and Snow White becomes queen of her castle. And the climax was nothing special, as this is not the Snow White I watched as a kid, as this movie is so bad. But how bad is it? Let's talk about it in a rating. I'll give this movie a 1.9 out of 10. Kristen Stewart is so far the worst Snow White yet to date, as I have yet to see how Rachel Zegler does with the performance in a couple of weeks. But in my opinion, Kristen Stewart is a terrible actress. After Twilight, which is a series I'll see about getting into one day, as as I never saw Spencer, but we'll see how that goes. I hear it's all about poor Princess Diana or whatever. As I don't care for Ravenna as the villain, as Charlize Theron has played better villains than this. And I can't connect with the Huntsman, the dwarves, or any other characters in this movie, as the acting in this is very bad. The plot doesn't make sense as it makes Snow White into fully badass mode, whereas last time I believed it from Lily Collins, despite she was a stupid Snow White, but they briefly made her badass. As this one is, it feels like it's throughout in the movie, as the sound effects were unforgiving, as the 1937 movie sounds better than this pile of crap. The story is weak, as this movie is weakly told by director Rupert Saunders, as this movie is ridiculous. And this has nothing to do, and like last time, this has nothing to do with the Snow White I watched as a kid. And the cinematography looked very bad, and the directing by Rupert Saunders is terrible, just like the remake of The Crow, which he did last year, which I reviewed last year. As this movie's plot makes no sense whatsoever, and at this point, I didn't give a crap. The special effects look awful, as this is by far the worst looking Snow White movie yet to date, as it was bad, but when I first saw it then, back in theaters, and it's still very bad now as it worsens in my memory. And this is a strong non-recommendation for this movie, because at the end of the day, this movie's too long for a Snow White movie, and there's just nothing anyone can do to fix this movie at all. And this is so far the worst of the Snow White movies I reviewed by far. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with The Huntsman, Winter's War, one more movie until I get to that 2025 live action Snow White thing. We'll see how that goes. But until we get there, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Definitely not me at this point.